Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 26. Today we'll discuss strategies for revision with a special focus on argument development. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your current Project 4 materials, as well as access to your weekly homework document. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll determine the greater purpose of your argument, we'll examine argument placement in your text, and we'll situate evidence and supporting reasons appropriately. The first thing that we want to focus on will be determining the argument's purpose. Now, recall that in this case, the term argument can be changed out with thesis or overall claim. It is, again, the main argument or the main point that you want to make. It is what you want people to think or to do or to act upon. So that's how we are using the term argument in this lecture by equating it with the term thesis or claim as we have defined and discussed in previous lectures. So the first thing that we want to do when we're revising for argument structure is we want to determine what you exactly want the argument to do. Now, pending on your topic, pending on your specific point of view, your argument can take on a number of forms, but those forms should just go beyond mere persuasion. So recall that Project 4 is a civic engagement argument. You want it to spark some kind of change, or ideally, it should spark some kind of change. Now, do you want people to think differently about a common or popular idea? Do you want to challenge the status quo in a dominant ideology or a dominant way of thinking about something that impacts members of your community or the community you're writing on behalf of? Is your argument organizing for change? Are you suggesting something specific occur within a particular time frame that would result in immediate or noticeable change for members of a particular community or group? Are you officially trying to enact a policy or law? So are you suggesting that curfew for teenagers in Washington County be extended from 11 p.m. to midnight on weekends? Are you trying to advocate that a particular law be put onto the books, either, let's say, for the city of Hurricane, perhaps the state of Nevada, or another type of community? So think about, are you trying to get a policy or law enacted? Now, with these ideas in mind, you should allow this to guide your revision and your evaluation, because if you find yourself saying, well, really, with this argument, I want to enact a new policy for the school district that my children are in, or I want to challenge the ways in which folks think about this certain idea that's very prevalent in the community I live in. And so when you are able to clearly define that purpose, then you can basically come back, look at all of the things that we're about to discuss and say, yes, these contents, the way that I've structured, how I talk about this reason, how I introduce this evidence, and how I use it to support my argument, all go back to changing a mindset, organizing for change, officially enacting a policy or law. And of course, these considerations can go beyond these three questions that I've established, or they can sort of delve into them in a more specific, refined way. They're just kind of springboards to get you thinking about what you ideally would like your publicly directed argument to do. The next thing that we'll want to do is we want to evaluate its place. This should, regardless of where your argument falls, and I'll explain what I mean by that here in just a moment, your argument should be the guiding piece or the guiding sort of component in your overall piece. So everything should tie back to your main argument, your thesis, your claim, and ultimately its purpose. Now, in academic writing, there are a couple different places you can find your argument, and it really is dependent upon the discipline you're writing for. More common than not, though, you will place it toward the beginning, and it typically does tend to open your overall body of work. However, there are some areas of study and academic disciplines in which the argument can be found toward the end of the piece. Now, what you'll want to consider is you want to consider how you want your audience to arrive at your argument. So, like I said, it usually arguments can be found toward the very beginning or at the very end. So if you open your argument, or if you open your piece with your argument, so basically starting with the thesis in your on your first or second page, then ultimately the audience will be greeted with it right out the gate. They will know exactly what, how to situate your evidence. They'll know exactly what your reasons speak to. Now, again, there are some disciplines where the argument can be found toward the end, and that is usually if there are a number of studies done, and, where you're trying to sort of let the evidence speak for itself. For the way in which Project 4 is designed, though, it might be better, I think, to put your argument toward the beginning, just because of the type of evidence most of you have expressed interest in engaging with and the type of arguments that you want to present. But it is worth discussing that sometimes arguments can be found at other points in academic works. But for the sake of Project 4, I would highly recommend situating your argument toward the beginning. Let's now talk about situating the evidence that we use. Now, when we think of evidence, remember that those are going to be your scholarly sources. Those are going to be the articles and the books and the studies that you are using to say, hey, look, there is some merit behind this argument that I'm making. Here are some reasons that I've provided, and look at how these other scholars in the field or these other experts in the field are basically affirming in a roundabout way the thesis that I'm presenting to you, the claim I'm making about this particular topic. As with any form of revision, again, we want to return to the audience and how the audience can best make sense of the content that we've given them. And when we keep a special eye out towards evidence, we want to think critically about how the audience is going to navigate that evidence and how they are going to understand its place within be it the specific reason or your overall claim. So think critically about the amount of agency your audience will have. Then you also want to critically consider how they will engage with each form of evidence. So are you going to present a visual? So perhaps including a pie chart? Are you going to include specific numbers? Are you going to include a direct quote? Are you going to make that a block quote? Are you going to paraphrase? Are you going to summarize? And how will you conveying that as the writer and presenting that evidence to your audience in that way as the writer? How is that going to influence how they can find that evidence in your overall work and how they're going to understand its place in supporting your reason and an overall argument? And then calling back to the core lecture from last week on word choice, think again about how your specific language, from the verbs, the adverbs, the adjectives that you're using, how is that going to influence your reader's perception of the evidence that they use? How are they going to understand how your argument sort of fits into that and speaks to that? So is your language indicating that you're building off what another source says? Is your language indicating that your argument and the source's evidence are in complete agreement? So, these are things that you want to be aware of. So how are you, through your word choice, situating your evidence within the overall argument that you're trying to present. Now let's discuss methods for assessing development. So we clearly determine what you want the argument to do. So, again, using those three questions as sort of springboards, do you want to enact actual change? Do you want to disrupt a popular way to think about something? Do you want to organize folks around a particular cause or a potential action? You also want to identify the audience you want to engage. The type of audience that you want to engage, of course, is going to have different values. They are going to privilege different types of information. So if you go back to our lectures on audience consideration and on audience awareness, you want to ensure that your values and the content you're including to represent and illustrate those values, you want to make sure that they're in line with what your audience values and what your audience is looking for, especially as it pertains to the argument you're trying to make and the topic you're trying to make an argument on. You also want to understand the affordances of your platform or genre. So in this case, we are writing a more traditional paper with alphabetic text. So we're using words. We're not really like using recordings. We're not designing a website or doing a social media campaign or anything of that sort. And so our platform in this case would be a print-based media. So like realistically, you could print off this essay and circulate it through those means, at least as it is occurring through Project 4. And our genre would be academic writing. Now, what academic writing allows us to do is it gives us the space in ways that other genres don't. So with typical nonfiction writing that's not academic in nature, it's typically a bit more compressed, or you don't have as much room to work with. So with Project 4, you've got about 10 to 12 pages to make a very compelling argument. If you're writing a magazine article, even if you're making a very similar argument, rather than having 10 to 12 pages, you might have 2 to 3. So that's going to influence, of course, maybe not necessarily the argument you're making, but the ways in which you convey that argument successfully, given the limitations that are placed upon you with that particular genre. You also want to review all included forms of evidence and support. And this really comes back to saying, okay, does this support the argument that I'm trying to make? But of course, we really do want to return to the question, will my audience see this as supportive of the argument that I'm trying to make? Have I framed it in a way that they will be able to make the connections necessary between the type of evidence and the type of support that I've included and the overall thought I'd like them to think or change I'd like them to enact? And finally, all of your choices must read as intentional. So it must be clear why you are making the argument you are. It must be clear why you are introducing the reasons you are. And it must be clear why you are introducing the forms of evidence that you are, including your counter argument, because we certainly don't want to forget about that, because that's a part of our argument in a very important way as well. So you want your audience to basically say, oh, okay, they brought in this study from this medical journal. That makes sense. I get why they did that. I think it supports their argument in this way, or I think it illustrates the point they're trying to make in this way or that way. The last thing you want your audience to say is, well, I really don't get why they introduced that scholar, or I don't understand why they decided to use a direct quote when they could have paraphrased or when they should have summarized. So every choice you make ought to be intentional and should be intentional if you want your audience to engage and immerse themselves in the argument that you're making most effectively. So to sort of summarize what we've talked about, when we are assessing our argument development, we can really do so by asking ourselves these 4 questions. First, will the audience be able to locate my argument? This one can be particularly difficult, especially if you look at it through the eyes of the writer, or if you're looking at it through your eyes as the writer. So at this point, you have become very knowledgeable on the topic you're writing on. You have developed a very firm opinion that is supported by evidence that you hope your reader will also accept. And so you might go through and say, oh yeah, they can easily locate my argument. It's right here. But again, you are the one who wrote it. You are the one who knows how to understand and navigate this material. So you want to put yourself in the shoes of your audience and say, okay, if someone perhaps isn't as knowledgeable as I am, or they are, experiencing this point of view that I'm presenting for the first time, will they be able to clearly identify that as I have it written? You also want to clearly determine the purpose of your argument. So you got to ask yourself, what is the purpose? What am I trying to accomplish? Realistically, pragmatically, what am I trying to accomplish with this? And then you'll use that purpose to really help say, okay, well, does my argument do this? Does the content I include do this? Does it speak to that purpose? The next thing you'll want to ask yourself, does the included evidence and reasons speak to both the argument itself and its purpose? Not just we should do this, but we should do this for this reason, or we should do this to enact this kind of change. The content that you've included, does it support that? Would it encourage your readers to think something in a certain way, or to enact a certain kind of change within a particular community? And then we also want to be aware of, how do I want my reader to experience and engage with my argument? So what I'd like you to do for the lecture assignment is I'd like you to review your current project for Rough Draft and any and all relevant project for materials that you have. Now, based off of the content we've discussed during this lecture, I'd like you to compose a brief reflection, so about 50 words, identifying a specific section in your writing you would like to improve with the strategies discussed during today's lecture. So, some ideas to get the ball rolling. Perhaps you could say, okay, well, with my second reason, it doesn't really speak to the purpose of my argument, or maybe this form of evidence isn't conveyed as clearly to align with my reader's values. So these are things that you can think of when developing your argument, not just for the sake of the argument itself, but for the audience who you want to persuade and enact or act upon that argument. So for your weekly homework, you're going to need to include the core lecture 26 summary and assignment in your week 14 homework submission. Overall, your week 14 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for core lectures 26 and 27, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. Now, that is all due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, November 24th. If you have any questions or would like to chat about this content further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.